In this video, I'm going to show you how I made these faux beams, but instead of wood, I used pink insulation foam. I'm an average dad, let's get to it. By the way, when I say I made these out of pink insulation foam, I don't mean I covered insulation foam in thin plywood or a wood veneer. I just mean foam board glued together. Now obviously with some tricks to make it look like wood, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Exposed ceiling beams are likely the result of a couple different scenarios in homes. First, solid pieces of wood were used structurally when the home was built. Second, hollow wood beams were added after the fact to imitate the look of solid beams. And then there's a third option. Hollow beams pretending to be structural wood beams, but not made of wood. Later I'll explain why I decided to go this route, but the obvious challenge then is getting the foam to not look like foam. So I think there's two appearance factors that'll be a dead giveaway to our realtor that we attach pink foam to the ceiling instead of actual wood. Texture and color. Well, I guess 3 factors if you count this video, but we'll assume that's not in the disclosures. Most of the wood ceiling beams I've seen typically have a somewhat rough texture and are not sanded very smooth. Pink insulation foam, however, has a very smooth and uniform texture. So I'll need to fix that so at various angles and lighting it's plausible that it's wood. Unrelated, but watching time saw table apps will never not make me nervous. Always seems like my fingers get so close. Anyway, the second aspect that could give us away is color. Real wood, unless it's finished with paint or solid stain, has seemingly infinite shades or hues of brown since it's a natural, non-uniform material. So I'll have to figure out how to replicate that variance in color. While it may seem like I'm rambling and this information really isn't important, hopefully it helps explain my thought process as I make decisions in later parts of the video. So in order to fool the next buyer of our house into thinking we spent a few $100s on real faux beams, we'll need to nail both the texture and the color aspect. To achieve this, I'm going to use some stain, paint, wire brush, and wood grain tool. Or at least that was the original plan, but things don't always go to plan. I'm going to use the wire brush to scratch the surface in the direction that you would expect the wood grain to be going. I also tried making some larger looking cracks using my soldering iron. If you were unaware of what all the tips are for that came with your hobbyist iron, I don't know either, but one of them probably looks like this and can be used to melt grooves into the foam. I ended up not doing this in the actual beams though, as it made it look a little too 1800s handmade, which as fun as that would be, isn't as believable in our middle class home built after Y2K. But it did work pretty well if you're into that sort of thing. For the color, I'm going to use a base coat that is a lighter brown and then a top coat that is a darker brown. Now, before I spent a bunch of time building the beams, I wanted to make some test pieces to make sure that we could achieve the look that we were hoping to get. For the first test piece, and yes, that is foreshadowing, I left one side smooth because I thought it would work better with the wood grain tool and then roughed up the other side. Ironically, this oil-based stain was pretty watery and was too runny for the wood grain tool to work very well. I tried to dry it partially with a heat gun first, but that really didn't help very much. You may have noticed, but I'm testing 2 different paints for the bottom coat and 2 different stains for the top coat. So I'll do the same thing on the backside, and the wood grain tool definitely didn't work as well. It really didn't take up much stain due to the uneven surface. So a couple days later, here's the results. The wood grain appearance on the smooth side is pretty neat, but it's still super shiny. You can see my silhouette in the reflection of the stain. I'm being careful to only touch the top and the bottom because after a few days it's still not anywhere close to dry. So that could become a headache when it's time to install the beams. The rough side lacks that wood grain visual, but the texture does look a lot more like real wood from further away. I wasn't happy enough with this to move forward though, so I wanted to try the method with 2 paints instead of a paint and a stain. While it wasn't awful, the opaque colors of the paint just didn't look as good to us as the colors created by the semi-transparent finish of the stains. But those stains still weren't dry. So as a final attempt, I got an acrylic solid stain and a semi-transparent exterior stain. It's a little hard to tell from this shot, but with the semi-transparent exterior stain, we finally had a winner. Now that I know what I'm using, I can start the actual bulk of work on this project. The first part being scratching the texture onto each face of the beam. Here you can kind of see how I'll scratch a circular pattern to make a knot, and then kind of rotate the brush to make the transition wood grain from the knot to the straight part. I'm sure there's a more technical term for that, but if I was into woodworking enough to know that, do you think I'd be making beams out of foam? I think the key improvement I made from the sample pieces to the actual beams is after I scratched deep grooves for the wood grain, I then would go back and kind of gently scratch the entire surface so there wasn't any of that smooth foam finish left. This is also probably part of the reason that the initial samples never dried, because that stain just sat on that smooth exterior finish of the foam. After each board is textured, I can assemble the beams. Before gluing on the sides, I glued 6 guide pieces on each base so that I could get all the edges to line up while assembling it alone. I tried using Super 77 spray adhesive from 3M for this. The advantage of it is it creates a nearly instant hold compared to the Gorilla Glue construction adhesive that took about an hour to set up and 24 hours to fully cure. According to another YouTube video, neither of these were supposed to react with or eat the pink foam, but one of my guide pieces did come off, so next time I'd probably use less of it or just wait for the construction adhesive to cure. For gluing on the sides, I'll put a bunch of dots or globs of the Gorilla Glue on the base and then just put the sides up against those support pieces and press it down. By the way, the dimensions I went with for these beams are 8 inches wide by 6.5 inches tall. These insulation sheets come in 4 by 8 foot pieces, but the span I'm putting these beams on is around 9 feet, so unfortunately I'm going to have a seam somewhere. To make it as hidden as possible, I'm going to have it as far to one side as I can, so then I'll need these extra small pieces to install after the 8 foot portions. So now all the boards have this nice texture, but where the sides meet the bottom, there's still these small gaps and the texture doesn't match. To solve this, I'm going to cover it all in joint compound, sand it down, and then re-scratch that texture to match the rest of the board. So I'll need to sand the joint compound so it isn't higher than the foam, but I'll also use this as an opportunity to give it a little bit of a round over so it looks like a solid wood beam would instead of having these super sharp 90-degree angles. So I'll go ahead and do that to the rest of the beams and then go ahead and vacuum up as much of the dust as I can before I paint. So for the minority of people watching this that actually try to build these, here's what the texture looked like before paint. I did go back and scratch up that joint compound so that matched the rest of the beams. And by this point, you may have noticed this took quite a bit of effort. And if you haven't already typed out a very constructive comment below, you may just be wondering to yourself, why on earth did this guy spend so much time doing it this way? And while I may be nuts, I do have a couple reasons. The first is cost. If you're new here, I really enjoy being thrifty and saving money where I can. The paint and stain I used to doing it this way would probably cost similar to using stain and polyurethane on a hollow wood beam. But the materials for the beams are actually pretty different. Now if you remember back to the beginning of the video, I did buy 2 sheets of foam board, but if it weren't for the sample pieces, I could have actually done these 2 with only 1 sheet. So that 1 sheet would only cost me $20, while if I would have made a real hollow wood beam, the wood for it in 1 buys would have cost about $160. So if you crunch the numbers on that, it's about $140 saved. Or, in another currency I sometimes use, about 15.5 Chipotle chicken burritos. But burritos aren't the only reason I chose foam. The second reason is ease of assembly. Since I'm going for the look of solid beams, I don't want it to just look like 3 boards with butt joints.
You had to do it with a foam brush or this?
Probably try the foam.
For the foam, I was able to use drywall mud to hide those joints, but I couldn't do that if I was using wood. I'd have to construct them using mitered corners, which sounds pretty intimidating since they're almost 10-foot beams. I'm not a good woodworker because I'm not really a woodworker, so it'd be hard for me to make it look good and difficult to assemble together. So I'm not a woodworker, but I do know when you stain wood with knots, the knots tend to soak up a ton of the stain and become a lot darker than the surrounding areas. So to match that, I'm going to use my bristle brush to apply a bunch of stain to these faux knots, or fauts, and then soften the contrast a little bit by brushing across it to the surrounding areas. You can see when I stain the knots right here that it really starts to sell the wood look of the beam. So if you're familiar with faux beams, you probably already know how this works, but to install them, I'm going to cut some scrap pieces of wood, attach those to the ceiling, and then the beams will slide over those and be screwed into them from the side. I screwed these into ceiling studs or joists, which definitely wasn't necessary to support the weight of the beams, but gave me a lot more confidence that they wouldn't move when I drilled into them from the side. A quick tip, since I couldn't hold the block, the screws, and my drill, I put a little bit of painter's tape on the back of the screws so they'd be captured within the blocks. This brings me to the third advantage of using foam over wood for these beams, being installation. Doing projects on the ceiling is never fun, and it's a lot less fun when it involves a lot of weight. Not counting paint and stain, the wood for these beams would have been about 40 pounds, while the foam was just over 2 pounds. And while 40 pounds may or may not sound like that much weight to you, depending on if your physique is as lean as mine, it is quite a bit of weight to hold above your head while you're trying to line stuff up on a ceiling. You can see here actually, the interference alone between the wood blocks and the beam was enough to hold it up. I did put screws in still though, just to make sure everything was flush to the ceiling and in case stuff shifted throughout different seasons and such. So now, with the 8 feet portions up, I just need the small remainder pieces to complete the beams. At the beginning of the project, I calculated these sections to be about 14 or 16 inches, which turned out to not be very close. Someone should come up with a saying about the ratio of how many times you measure to how many times you cut on projects. Anyway, I'll cut these down and it's still going to be a pretty tight fit, so I'm just going to put a little bit of that construction adhesive on the parts that are already on the ceiling and then slide those new pieces into place. On the second beam, I had an issue where the U-shape didn't match between the two beams, so I used a little extra construction adhesive and some nails to hold it in place while it cured to match them up. So now to blend in those seams, I'll just need to apply joint compound, sand it down, and then finish it with paint and stain. And just like that, we're done. So the total cost for this project on the building of the actual beams was $22 for the pink foam sheet, $24 for 1 quart of paint, though I only used half, $6 for semi-transparent stain, $9 for the wire brush, $10 for other paint and stain brushes, and the rest of the drywall mud, scrap wood, and mounting screws I already had. So that gives us a grand total of $71. Pretty good.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
If you thought this video was just a little bit interesting, it'd be awesome if you could hit that like button. And if you're really feeling wild and it's a Tuesday, you could also subscribe. If you do end up doing this project, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear if this helped you out. Thanks so much for watching.